All right, guys, let's talk about our nutrient cycles or our biogeochemical cycles. Now, biogeochemical is a really big name, but it's a pretty easy thing because bio we know means life, geo means earth, and chem is referring to the elements. And remember, this is in a cycle. So I'm cycling of my elements through my living and my non-living things on earth, right? There's three big biogeochemical cycles we're going to look at. The first one, the easiest one, is the water cycle. Water is also known as hydrologic cycle. And so since it's a cycle, we don't really have a beginning or end, so we'll just start one place. Let's start with precipitation, right? So when it starts to rain or when it starts to snow or whatever the case is, that's what precipitation is, okay? So we'll just put a little number. Precipitation is when water falls from your sky in some capacity, okay? Now, when it when it falls from the sky, you have two options, okay? You can either have percolation, and percolation is when that water seeps into the soil and it goes into those underground aquifers, like where we store fresh water within our earth, okay? That's percolation. Or we can experience runoff. Okay, there's number two. Runoff is when the water doesn't seep into the soil and he ends up in my rivers and streams and lakes and oceans, right? So precipitation, water falls. When water falls, it either seeps through the ground into the soil and it can end up in my underground aquifers, or it can run off and back up into my streams and my lakes. Now that I've had water in my streams and lakes, I can actually lose water from these bodies of water. That's what evaporation is. So evaporation is when I turn from liquid water to a gas, right? We've all seen evaporation before. Say we live in our summers get pretty hot, and so we've seen puddles dry up, etc. Say that's evaporation. So that's going to add water into the atmosphere. That's where condensation comes in. So condensation is when water vapor, which we had from evaporation, ends up and goes up into my clouds where it starts to condense. I mean, we've seen condensation on our cups when it's a really hot day out and then they start to sweat on the outside. That's because the cup is much cooler, and so all of the water vapor in the air, when it comes close to the cup, it condenses, and that's why we get sweat on the outside. But a lot of the evaporation that happens will end up condensing inside my clouds, right? And then I also can lose water from my plants. This is a special kind. This is called transpiration. Transpiration is a loss of water into a plant, which will end up going into my clouds for condensation. Because then once I condense and I have enough water in my clouds, then it'll fall back down as precipitation and then go back through that whole system again, either as percolation as through runoff. So that's the water cycle. I'm hoping you guys are pretty familiar with that one. Let's go into our next one. This is the carbon cycle, okay? Now, carbon cycle, really what we're talking about is we're talking about CO2. Okay, say carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is our focus on the carbon cycle. Now we know that we have carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Okay, when we have carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, there is one process that takes my CO2 in, and that's called photosynthesis through my plants. So my plants are the only organisms in our pretty little green earth of ours that takes in CO2. Right? That's called carbon fixation. Carbon fixation. So carbon fixation is when I take that atmospheric CO2 and I turn it into something usable like glucose. All right? So I have photosynthesis taking it in, but don't forget, I have plants and animals, plants and animals that spit my CO2 back into the atmosphere. That's cell respiration, because don't forget, plants and animals both do cell respiration. And so when we breathe out, that CO2 is going to go back into the atmosphere. Now, there's other things that spit CO2 in the atmosphere, like decomposition. And so when this dead bunny right here, when he dies and decomposes, that actually releases CO2 back in the atmosphere. And when these dead plants, when they start to decompose, they also release CO2 back in the atmosphere. That's called decomposition. Decomposition, when when dead matter start to decay, then they can release CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, for what it's worth, when we have those two things start to decay, they can also start to make fossil fuels. Because fossil fuels, how we get them, this is just dead, compressed matter. That's what our coal is. That's where we get our oil from. And then what we do with those fossil fuels is we use them to power our factories, and we also use them to power our cars. So when we use those fossil fuels and we start to burn them, that also releases CO2 back out into the atmosphere. Okay, that's what combustion is. So combustion is when I burn fossil fuels. Okay, when I burn fossil fuels, that releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. Also, just burning things in general, like when we have big fires and stuff, that also releases CO2 in the atmosphere. And so if I look at this pretty picture, there is only one thing right here. These arrows for number 1, there is only one thing that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that's photosynthesis. Everything else spits it back out. That's why when we talk about global warming is a huge issue, because I have tons of things spitting CO2 in the atmosphere. And when I have a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere, that's like putting a blanket on the earth. So the sun rays can come in. So let's just pretend here's my earth. So when I have a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere, that puts a big blanket on it. So the sun that's out here, right? The sun rays can go in, but they can't leave. Say they just bounce back. And when they bounce back, that's going to increase the temperature of the earth. And that's where global warming is concerned, which is a massive deal, because when we have global warming, we know that we have a bunch of ice caps. Well, those ice caps are going to melt. And what's really bad about the ice caps melting is that there is a bunch of dead matter in there. And so besides the ice melting, it's also exposing all this dead matter, which is releasing more CO2 in the atmosphere. And so that's why global warming is something that's kind of irreversible at this point, because everything that we do as humans is just putting more and more out there. And the one thing that takes them in are trees, and that's the thing we're cutting down. So there's your CO2, or there's your carbon cycle. Now we have the nitrogen cycle, okay? Now the nitrogen cycle is the one we're probably least familiar with. We have atmospheric nitrogen in our atmosphere. Atmospheric nitrogen actually makes up around 80% of the atmosphere. So the stuff that you're breathing in, 80% of it's nitrogen. But I can't use nitrogen in this form. But remember, down here in the corner, I need nitrogen to build amino acids. And amino acids, that's going to help me build my proteins, okay? And so I need nitrogen inside our systems. We need it inside our systems. We need it inside our systems because we need to be able to build proteins. And so what we need to do first is we need to take this atmospheric nitrogen and we need to convert it into something that's usable, all right? That's called nitrogen fixation. And so when this nitrogen, right here, so nitrogen fixation is when I take atmospheric nitrogen and I convert it into something I can actually use. And I'll either convert it into ammonia or I'll convert it into nitrates, right? And so how I do that is through a process called nitrification. So inside my soil, I have all these awesome little bacteria. These awesome little bacteria are going to be able to take that atmospheric nitrogen, and they're going to be able to turn it into ammonia, right? Whoops, into ammonia. And so then when those bacteria turn into ammonia, I have another set of bacteria that can turn it into nitrates, right? And so, oops, I got my numbers wrong. And so what happens is by fixing it, then my plants can take it up. And when my bacteria do that, then my plants are going to be able to take up these nitrates. That's called assimilation. And so assimilation is when I get to take my pretty nitrates up through plants. And then when the plants can take it in, then they can start turning them into those amino acids and stuff, which then, once my plants take those in, organisms can eat those plants to get my nitrogen. So either the cow can eat the plant, or we can eat the plant, or we can eat the animals that eat the plants, and that's how we get our nitrogen from. And then we have another set of bacteria inside our soil that can take that ammonia. They can take that ammonia, and then they can spit it back out into the atmosphere, back into N2. And that's called denitrification, because D means undo. All right, so those are 3 biogeochemical cycles. We have the water cycle, we have my carbon cycle, and then we have the nitrogen cycle. Hope that helps.